Hello, we are here at the PowerShell Conference 2023 in Prague, and with me is Jakub, but I'm a bit afraid that I do not pronounce his name correctly, so please introduce yourself.
My name is Jakub Jareš. You said it perfectly.
Thank you. I took the chance. You're one of the local heroes. You're from the Czech Republic, and from what I know, you're living here in the neighborhood, and you're also one of the organizers of this event. So try to tell a little bit about your home country and how does it feel to be back at home with that special event that you attended before multiple times, but now here in the area where you live?
To me, it's a little dream come true because I always wanted to present about PowerShell in Prague, and I didn't really had that many chances to present about PowerShell in Czech Republic or about C# in Czech Republic. I usually have to go abroad to a conference like PSConfEU in Vienna to talk about PowerShell. And so here I have the chance to present about PowerShell, about Pester, about Profiler, and also introduce people to the local culture, show them the things that we love, like beer and good meat and good food, and show them what they can sightsee in Prague. So I also have been living in Prague for a long time, even though I moved out recently, but I still love the city and plan to return to it once my children will grow. So it's amazing to have people here in Czech Republic.
Yeah, have you been born here in that area and grown up as a young kid?
I was born quite far away, like 40 kilometers away from Prague, and lived there until I was 18, and then I moved to Prague and lived there ever since.
Yeah.
And then I moved back into the other area again.
Prague is such a beautiful city and so beloved by all the tourists. It's sometimes a bit crowdy, isn't it? As someone who's living here, is that annoying, or is it a pleasure to see that all the people from abroad come to see that nice city?
It's a bit of both. We locals don't really go into the touristic area that often. And when you do, you sometimes feel a little disappointed in what they become. You can see a man dressed up as a polar bear in the Old Town Square just to get some money. And that kind of sucks to me. But on the other hand, it's nice that it brings a lot of people here, and I think there are many people like, I don't know, Honest Guide, who are trying to show both the touristic sites as well as the other parts of Prague that people might be interested in, and like show them that they don't have to eat expensive food in expensive restaurants that are close to the major touristic sites. They can also venture a little bit more into the city, use like a pink bike to navigate the city instead of taking a taxi or an Uber or a sightseeing bus, or they can use a tram and just go directly to the Prague Castle. And so I think it's a mix of both. It can be a little bit annoying, but it's also nice to have a lot of people visiting here.
I'm pretty sure anyone who's visiting the conference this week will go back home and tell his friends, his partner, let's come back to Prague. So remember that I will ask you at the end of the interview something like an insider tip. You already said a little bit. You can hire a bike. That might be the best way to explore the city. But at the end of the interview, maybe just one more thing. But first of all, let's focus on our work. You mentioned that it's hard for you to speak to an audience in the Czech Republic because that's the reason why you often talk abroad. How is that IT community here in the Czech Republic compared to other countries? You've been a lot to other countries.
I cannot really compare, but sadly, I think the PowerShell community in here is quite non-existent.
It's you and Igor?
Yes, but we are not surrounded by 200 other people, like Yap, for example. When you go to his conference, it's just a room full of people. When I was organizing stuff here, we had like 5-7 people attending. And then it's difficult to spend a lot of time to be preparing for a small audience, and so many people don't want to commit to that. And then you cannot grow the audience to be larger because you don't have content and you don't have the reach. And it's also like a second thing for me that is a little bit blocker is that I have hard time speaking about technology in Czech language. I just don't think about it in Czech anymore because I work at a work where like we've been primarily talking in English. Every book you read on technology is in English because that's the most up to date, most accurate usually. And so if I have to present in Czech, I have a hard time coming up with the right words. Or I spend telling most of the content like in the English words, like you say class instead of what we would say třída, and so on. So it's a combination of both. But if there was a bigger community around PowerShell, if probably the .NET community was bigger or maybe more welcoming, or maybe I would be trying harder, then I might get to more conferences. But at the moment, I'm also quite happy to just be presenting on one conference per year, which would be PSConfEU.
First of all, I have to apologize for any Czech IT professional that I didn't mention right now, just 2 minutes ago. But I'm pretty sure there are some more that might listen to this. You mentioned Jab and the Dutch community. Some countries solve that problem by, from my point of view, completely refusing to do anything in their local language, just like you do in the Czech Republic. But the bigger the country is, for example, France or Italy or Germany, then you are forced to split your brain into two parts. And I can also say that I really know your pain. So it is definitely easier to use the Prestine words, to use the English terms, because anyone is so used to that. You're very famous. You became, from my point of view, super famous just because of your tool Pester. We will talk a little bit about that. But first of all, what did you do before you became with such a famous tool, so popular? What did you do before? What was your personal IT background?
I think coming into Pester was a little bit of luck, and it was at the start of my career, actually. If you would try to look up my first pull request on GitHub, that was actually a commit to Pester changing colors for some of the output, because at that time we were all using Power GUI, if you still remember that editor, and it had two modes in the output, a dark mode and a light mode. And I was using light mode, and the colors didn't really render that well. So I was trying to add an option into Pester to have different colors, and that was my first pull request ever, I think, and first time using Git. And so Pester have been with me since the start of my career. And Pester was also a motivator for me to learn PowerShell better, because I was assigned a task which was like write a power management solution for Windows, which at that time was non-existent. Nowadays, you will get like a prompt from Windows that will say your computer will reset, you get suggestions about power and so on. But at that time, nothing like that was there. And so I was trying to automate this in PowerShell because I've been to a course which took like a month. And I understood nothing. I didn't know what I'm doing. And then I realized there might be something like unit testing. So I looked through all the available tools at that time, which was Pester, I think PS8 or how it was called. Like 3 or 4 frameworks. I just chose Pester because it had the most features. And then I joined the project, which was kind of like a stale at that time. And I started contributing to the PowerShell Conf forums, which I think are now either defunct or like not very active. And I basically just spent a year or two just thinking about PowerShell and Pester.
Have you learned any other scripting or programming language before that?
I think I did a little bit of VB, and I always looked a little bit like into C# and in that direction. But it was until much, much later until I became a proficient developer in C# or TypeScript or similar languages, and also started experimenting with other languages, like Lisp, Rust, C, but those were just for toy projects most of the time. And so I think PowerShell was like my first serious scripting language that I like spent a lot of time and was able to, express myself in it rather than just following a tutorial. And so this really helped me solve so many problems and so many other problems that's why PowerShell has a fond place in my heart. Even if I wasn't a owner of like one of the most popular framework, I would still be using it and using it a lot.
If you Bing or Google or what search ever engine, however, if you Bing or Google Pester, it is obvious that you own Pester. You are Pester. But as you mentioned before, this is not, you didn't invent that from scratch. It was already there. Who started that project?
So this project was started by Scott Motz, a guy who wrote the first code after he was hangover on 1st of January after some New Year's party to automate testing of his code of a module that was parsing YAML files, I think, at that time. And he based it on RSpec, which he knew from Ruby. And that was the start. Then there were a few more people, which I cannot remember by name right now, but I know I summarized all of this in my blog in like 7 years of Pester article, I think, with all the documentation. And then it kind of started to die off. And then I think I came, and at that time, like I started popularizing it on the PowerShell magazine. I wrote a few articles. And then Dave Wyatt came, and I think after that, Adam Bertram for some time. And that, I think, all of this attention and like this need for people to automate more and test more brought Pester to like spotlight to the extent that all the other tools that were testing kind of died off because they didn't have this active community around them. And then people ended up using Pester for everything because we were never trying to gatekeep anyone from using it in any way. So people started automating infrastructure, people started automating checking databases, which I think DBHX is probably like one of the biggest consumers or reasons that people are relying on Pester and investing into it. So I think it's just the ecosystem is connected, and the more I think it's like beyond the critical mass. Now when you want to do testing, you pick up Pester because everyone else is using it.
If I may quote Tobias on that, Tobias Weltner, I remember that he once said in a presentation that it takes a while to understand Pester, to understand the basic ideas, and to really get the right key to open the door. I would describe that in my own words. We have not yet explained what Pester is. We should do that now. But I was just thinking about the name to pest, pest is something that you want to get rid of, right? So Pester is not a nice name, but we can think about it as I want to get rid of all the bad things. What does that mean to that name mean to you? And if you would have the chance to rename it, would you name it would you give it another name?
Mm-hmm. The whole literal word means to annoy someone.
Yeah.
Same, they say in Dutch it means to be a bully. Mm-hmm. And so, but in reality, it's just a play on the word tester and adding a P before it because that was very popular at that time. I don't think people see it as that actual word. So if I had the chance, I probably wouldn't rename it because I think it's just now synonymous with testing in PowerShell, and we shouldn't change that.
Yeah. Maybe it's a perfect name. It's pretty popular. So now we have to think about, okay, what is that? Just imagine someone that, you're doing a lot of talks. Let me start it by that. What's new in Pester? But if I was completely new to Pester, and I know a little bit about PowerShell, but I have no clue what Pester is all about. And you said there are no constraints. You can use that for multiple things that you want to do. Can you explain in an easy language what is the basic idea and what it does?
Yeah, sure. So at its essence, it's just an automation tool that is able to run some task, and this task can either pass or fail. And we can run multiple tasks in a row. And whatever those tasks do, we want to somehow ensure that they did the thing that we wanted them to do. And so if we kind of zoom out of this, Pester is not just a testing framework. It's basically something that can run a list of tasks and make sure that they work. And in most forms, those take form of a test. So we run some code which either returns a data or have some kind of behavior, like it starts a different command. And then we check if the data are correct or if the other command was started. And we call these things that we ensure them with a special set of functions which are called assertions. And so basically the whole thing that Pester does is that it allows you to start a task, check the return data, and if they agree with what you expected them to be, it will present it as a green result, as a green test. If they don't agree or something else happens, like an error is thrown, it will show you a red result. And then at the end, it will tell you a summary of how many of those tasks or tests passed and how many failed. So this can then be applied to many other things. If you want to start with a Pester or start writing Pester test, I usually say, what do you do manually? How do you make sure your tool is working? And you say, I will start this commandlet. I will look at the data and it actually gives me the user. And I say, okay, do exactly this, but write it in code. Have a variable, call the commandlet, then take the variable, check if the data are there. And that's it. That's the whole idea of testing.
So that kind of hello world example.
Yeah, a hello world example would be calling a function that returns some data or a string, or reversing a string. That's kind of a popular example. And then you just give it one piece of data, it does something inside, and then you expect it to give you some result. And then you make sure that the result is the same as what you expected.
How does that work internally?
Internally, okay, this particular part is very simple. The assertion just checks the values for equality, and if they are not equal, it returns an error or throws an exception, and then Pester is just like a try-catch block around this. I have a talk which lists all of those basics, shows all the internals in the most simple terms, and that can help you understand the internals and how to start with Pester.
The next term that you will find on the search engine, Googling Pester, finding your name, is the term unit tests. How does that relate to Pester?
Oh, unit tests. I think this is kind of just a little bit leaking from like the other parts of developer world, but it doesn't apply that much to PowerShell because PowerShell in the end is an integration tool. It's the glue language between all the other tools. You take whatever executable, whatever API service, and then you use PowerShell to automate it. And so in a lot of the cases, the code that you would write in PowerShell itself means nothing if you don't have the services around. And so I think PowerShell developers don't really have that much of a need for a unit test because they don't often do very isolated things that would only look at some kind of data and process them. But a unit test in PowerShell for me would be a function that takes some data, does something to them like, hashes them, inverses them, summarizes them, and then returns the data. So that would be quite easy to unit test because it's kind of in a vacuum where you don't have to do anything.
Right now that we're sitting here in the year 2023, I would say the PowerShell world is split into two items. That is the old Windows PowerShell that is all over the places. And this is the latest and greatest PowerShell 7, but this one you need to install. How does Pester work with these two different, I like to say generations. Is that a big topic in using Pester, or is it totally agnostic or something in between?
So I hope that from the point of view of the user, the usage is agnostic. We, for a long time, have been sticking with PowerShell version 2, just because we believe in the project that you should be able to test as many things as you can with the framework, and so it shouldn't be limiting you from getting new features if you have to be stuck with old PowerShell version. Or in the more usual case, if you are creating a module yourself that is trying to keep this like promise, where you would say, we are supporting everything from PowerShell v2 up or everything from PowerShell v3 up, then Pester shouldn't be a problem for you, shouldn't be limiting. Internally, we have a lot of ifs that check, is this version of PowerShell in place? Is this happening? We also have additional features that you cannot normally use. So for example, the AST, the abstract syntax tree, was introduced in PowerShell 3. And when we were sticking with PowerShell v2, we had a lot of code that either couldn't be done and we had to skip over the feature, or we had to work around it in a different way. Also, as PowerShell evolved, there are some edge cases that behave differently between, for example, PowerShell v2 and PowerShell v3. If you did iteration in for each, they behave differently. If you gave for each a null, it would actually iterate once in v2. There are tons of errors that are thrown differently between like v3 and v5. So those are the challenges that are on our side. But from the point of view of the user, they shouldn't be able to distinguish most of the time.
If I would have never heard of Pester, I would assume that I can install it, edit with the usage of the PowerShell gallery. And this leads to the question, you said that the PowerShell version is not such a big thing, but maybe you had different versions of Pester, and maybe that is something that you have to take care for if you have some code base from a colleague that created 2 or 3 years ago using Pester back in those days. Is that a big thing? Do I have to take care of such a thing, like breaking changes in Pester, stuff like that?
We did a big breaking change between Pester v4 and v5. There we changed quite a lot. We changed how we required users to write the code, where they should put their setup, but we still left Pester 4 on gallery. It's stable. If there is a critical fix, we maintain it. So we don't force anyone to upgrade, and a lot of the projects actually don't. They start with a new project on Pester 5 and keep the old projects on Pester 4. But that's definitely a consideration for every project. If you want to move forward, you want to introduce new features, you want to introduce new scenarios where things are usable. For example, for Pester 5, that was interactive use within Visual Studio Code, I mean, that required a total different architecture inside that we just couldn't do without the breaking changes. And so we introduced a new basis, a new tree model inside of Pester 5 that now serves us to implement other new features. Internally, it's just structured very, very differently than Pester 4, even though the functionality is kind of similar.
I think anyone should engage with that. So I think Pester became more and more a core utility. So just like, to give a totally different example, just like VS Code, you have to fiddle around with that because VS Code is much more than an editor today. And despite the fact that there is no necessity to need Pester, if you just want to script something, it makes a ton of sense and you will find a lot of references. You said the same is true for me. Your personal career is connected to PowerShell. And that brings me to my final question before we go to the socializing in Prague. My question is, what's on your wish list for the future? And broaden it a little bit. If you think about PowerShell, I mentioned the 2 generations, which I think for the regular user, this is a topic. It's a huge problem that you have that Windows PowerShell all over the places, and you have that PowerShell 7 where everything that's new goes into that. Do you have something on the wish list? How do you see the evolution of PowerShell? And maybe there is a connection to Pester also. What will the future bring?
That's a very broad, very hard question. I think every software developer, when they ship, I don't know, sixth or seventh version of their product, they have knowledge that they wish they had at the start. I'm looking forward for the day where PowerShell 5 will be a legacy and might not even be by default installed into Windows, and where Windows would ship with PowerShell Core and hopefully a very recent version of PowerShell. Or I mean PowerShell. I say PowerShell Core, but I mean PowerShell. It's quite confusing with the naming recently. And so if we would be able to only support like the recent two versions of PowerShell, it would be a godsend for a lot of modules that are popular, because we could reduce the amount of code that we need to have for previous versions. And nowadays, as they shown today on the state of the shell, they have telemetry and they have data, but I don't think there are any such data for PowerShell 5. So unfortunately, because no one knew before and wasn't able to collect the telemetry, we don't know how much stuff is used in PowerShell 5 and so on. And so, for example, what I'm trying to look into is doing the same kind of instrumentation for Pester, seeing at least some usage data of Pester 4, Pester 5, you know, how much impact that would have on people to actually have telemetry in the module, if it would be acceptable for them or if they would opt out all the time. And so for me, more visibility into how people are using Pester, more like better upgrade paths and so on would be great. Also, it would be awesome if we would have more core maintainers of Pester, if we would have maybe a team of 5 or 10 people or a company contributing more heavily into this without trying to steer it into any way. That I think would be awesome.
Yeah, if you hear that and if you have plenty of time and knowledge, reach out to Jakub. I have an extra question that came into my mind. There is another topic, desired state configuration, heavily discussed. It's getting a little bit more popular again. Things happen. And if I think about desired state configuration and its special syntax, the declarative thing, it reminds me a little bit of Pester. So that my bonus question is, what's your thought about desired state configuration?
I honestly don't have any thoughts on that. I have very little knowledge on desired state configuration about the tools around. I know there have been boom of DSL languages. I think DSC comes like into kind of the same area as Bicep and other such tools. And I personally am not an administrator and I'm not maintaining infrastructure, so I only know very little about this and don't really have any thoughts.
But anyhow, it will be very interesting to watch out for these topics, and we will not repeat the sessions that were delivered here. There is no necessity for that. You should have a watch at the sessions that you brought here, and maybe older ones that are more feasible for the beginner or for some special topics that you explained maybe a year ago. So finally, we're back at the future tourists of Prague. Do you have an insider tip beyond that, what you already mentioned? What is your personal favorite spot? There is a zoo, for example, or Kolovna. Is that the right name in the north of Prague? Do you have any special thing that you want to recommend?
I think it's quite touristic, but one place that has a special place in my heart is the Vrtba Garden, which is very close to the center, but it's often missed by visitors. It's a beautiful, beautiful garden just in the center, and I also had a wedding with my wife there. Mm-hmm. So we always return every year, and I could recommend to everyone to go and visit it at least once because it's really nice and you get amazing view of the castle.
Can you repeat the name of that venue?
It's called Vrtba, VRTBA, Vrtba Garden.
So, if I find the time, I will find the Wikipedia article and link that anyone find that. So that is the best possible ending. So romantic. So greetings to your wife. And Jakub, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.